Hello.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yep, all
Great.
good.
Okay, perfect. I think since I have to pull in Mike and Karin from the
Mhm.
attendance, I'm just gonna go ahead and start it now.
Okay, okay. I think I'm good to go.
Hi everyone. I am just finishing one last thing and we will get started really soon. Thank you. I think everyone's here. Okay, great. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel on offshore wind and fisheries. My name is Charles Lockwood, and I am a co-director of Land or Water, and I will be moderating this panel. I just have a few announcements, and then we will get the panel started. First, if you're an attendee, don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all of the attendees are automatically muted with their videos off, so you'll only be able to see the panelists. Throughout the panel, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there will be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for this panel, I will be dropping a link to register and pay on Jotform if you have not. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide those students with stipends, information to do so will also be located in the Google Doc along with CLE accreditation. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Alihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were depossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, those descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, as well as the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz. Please, Pilk would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for traditional tribal nations of the Oregon. I will now briefly introduce our panelists. Dr. Karin Barabi is the manager of the Marine Resource Program for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, providing strategic leadership on all things ocean within the state of Oregon and across the West Coast. Karin and her staff build relationships with industry, academic researchers, and tribal governments, as well as federal and state agencies, stakeholders, and elected officials to collaboratively define and achieve both economic and ecosystem resilience. Her work is grounded in both fishery ecosystem stewardship with a particular focus on changing ocean conditions. As chair of Oregon's legislatively created Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Coordinating Council and a council member on Pacific Fisheries Management Council, Karin is helping West Coast communities and fisheries develop successful strategies to adapt to and mitigate ocean change. She received her doctorate from Stanford University's Hopkins Marine Station and has conducted scientific research from estuaries out to deep sea hypothermal vents of the Pacific Ocean. Karin's career began by exploring West Coast tide pools and from the time she could walk. We also have Jason Searman, Senior Energy Policy Analyst for the Oregon Department of Energy. Jason has an education in civil and environmental engineering, business, and the law, and his work focuses on the intersection of renewable technology, clean energy, and the power grid. Susan Chambers is currently Deputy Director of the West Coast Seafood Processors Association, but has been involved in commercial fisheries since grade school. She purchased her first commercial fishing license at age 12. After a 9-year stint in Minnesota after high school, she returned to the Southern Oregon coast and worked as a reporter/editor for the local newspaper covering commercial fishing issues. She has also worked as a deckhand on commercial vessels periodically, fishing for Dungus crab, long lining for saddlefish, halibut, and catching live rockfish. She has written several trade journals over the years as well, before being hired as deputy director for seafood processors in 2009. Susan lives in Coos Bay with 2 dogs and 4 cats. And lastly, Mike Oak Connecky, a native Washingtonian who has been working in the fishing industry since 1970. Mike has worked in every facet of the fishing industry, including warehousing, logistics, and even operating his own small fish company and brokerage. Currently, he works for Pacific Seafood as a plant GM for 5 individual West Coast operations, including bottomfish, shrimp, crab, sardines, squid, albacore, and salmon. Mike also serves on 12 panels, boards, international advisory panels, etc., covering Alaska, the West Coast, and some Canadian. And we will go ahead and get started now. I believe you are up first, Dr. Brabi.
Great, I would be happy to do that. And thank you, Charles, and my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to hearing comments from the 3 of you, and hopefully some good questions from the audience. And your introduction of me was great, and covered some of my introduction. I really wanted the audience to understand that I have both a foot in ecosystem protection and management, and in fisheries protection and management. As the co-chair of the Oregon Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council, climate change, ocean change are incredibly important and present in my thinking. And so renewable energy and our transition away from fossil fuels, from polluting practices, are really important to me as a marine biologist, as an Oregonian, and as a manager of the ocean for Oregon. So it's what we're going to be talking about today really is one of our natural resource thorny problems. There are no simple solutions here. We're talking to you about offshore wind, which is one of the newer potential options for renewable energy solutions to get us off of fossil fuels. But I want to stress that it comes, any new energy, any new development comes with costs. There is no free lunch. It's not the perfect solution because there are trade-offs. And I think the panel today is perfectly positioned to talk about some of those potential trade-offs. And so the onus really is on us as we approach renewable energy development and transition to those fuels, that we do so with our eyes wide open, and that we do it very carefully and responsibly, because green energy can be very dirty if done incorrectly. So I hope I'm going to be able to touch on, I'm a scientist, I am not a lawyer, but I hope that I'll be able to kind of pinpoint a couple of ideas that have a direct nexus to the law, both federal and state, as well as really point to some of our cultural and social challenges that we have moving forward, in addition to kind of the biology and fisheries aspects of it. So I think to start off with, since I am first, offshore wind in Oregon, in the West Coast and on the East Coast, is a process that is shepherded by a federal agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management. And right now, Oregon has a task force with BOEM, and that is a government level task force. The governor of Oregon, Governor Brown, is maintaining that agreement with BOEM, and the task force convenes periodically to talk about how offshore wind is developing and how that would be sited offshore. Offshore is anywhere outside of 3 miles. Our territorial sea is our state authority, our state waters. Outside of that, it's federal water authority. And the BOEM process is definitely one that is, they are the leasing agent for the federal government. So they're the ones who have the authority to lease what is public trust waters outside of 3 miles. And the BOEM process is set up to encourage leases and encourage development, encourage exploration of those federal waters. It is not well suited to set up a balanced stakeholder-driven process. And so we're really struggling as a state right now to try and create a balanced process that is kind of inconsistent with the way BOEM has been set up. It is a process that creates a lot of conflict because it kind of, it designates or it allows ownership of ocean first and then asks questions second. And the kinds of questions that we're talking about are, what are the existing uses of offshore waters? What are the potential impacts of development in these open waters on the ecosystem, on existing users, on view sheds, on coastal property values, on coastal jobs, coastal economics, rural vulnerable communities along the Oregon coast that could both benefit from or be damaged by irresponsible development of those offshore waters. So there are a lot of issues that are being discussed and considered, and some of them are based in law, some of them are based in kind of cultural values of place and practice. And so we're navigating this whole process together and trying to work as a state to set up a balanced and fair process. But it's challenging, and that is maybe one of the themes one of the legal themes that I'd like to stress today, which is that there is partnership and collaboration across federal agency, federal law, and state agency and state law. But it is often a relationship that has deep conflicts and deep disconnects. And from the state perspective, we have a culture of stakeholder bottom-up process, and the federal process is very different. BOEM is implementing a mandate and policy that has been generated by the Biden administration, and that's through a new executive order. So that's an additional aspect of federal law or policy that's involved in this process. And going back to BOEM, we have a couple of different milestones in their process that we are thinking about and working on right now. So the first step, the first formal step of the BOEM process is to establish call areas, which literally is lines in the water offshore of Oregon. And those lines have been drawn. They're called call areas because the intent is to call for information about those areas. And from there, theoretically, a smaller area from within these call areas will be established as what's called wind energy areas. And then from there, leases would be issued, which would be a subset of those wind energy areas. So it's kind of, we're in this, establishment of a large area and then winnowing down into these smaller and smaller areas. The call areas that have just been published or have just been announced and are about to be published formally in what's called the Federal Register, which is the place where federal agencies publish all proposed rules and final rules under federal law. Those call areas are really busy places. There pretty much are no areas in those call areas that do not have some kind of use, some kind of ecosystem value to them. And so it's not an easy decision to say where within these call areas should we put wind energy. And there are a lot of questions arising right now about whether any of these areas are suitable from current user and current ecosystem protection perspective. So really challenging, conflict-ridden issues. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of the resources that are in question. I mentioned some of them in my introduction. Some of the resources that are important to Oregon include rock habitat, which as a biologist makes a ton of sense and is kind of self-explanatory. Maybe to a webinar of lawyers that may not make as much sense. So I'll describe that a little bit. Rock habitat, rock in the ocean is relatively rare. There are wide swaths of sand, mud, other types of sediment, soft sediment, and rock outcrops, rock habitats, think of coral reefs, are relatively unique and therefore attract a lot of biology, rich biodiversity. So those are areas we want to protect, and we don't know where all of the rock areas are, and so we'll have to work on that with BOEM as they continue with their leasing process. I already mentioned the importance of fisheries. Fisheries are one of the most significant users of the ocean. There are a lot of recreationalists, shipping interests, navigation interests. A lot of those can move where they function. Fisheries, not so much, because they are working from species that are place-based. You know, the fish live in particular places where they are successful. They don't move in the same way that you could tell a boat to go a little bit left instead of a little bit right on your journey across the ocean. And so that really important place-based activity is most likely to be impacted out of the current understanding of human uses in the ocean. I already mentioned, you know, coastal community economics, and those are diverse. And I'm certainly not an economist, so I'm not going to be comprehensive, but things like tourism, jobs, even jobs in restaurants, jobs in grocery stores, all of those things on the coast of Oregon are very tightly tied to the fishing industry. And so impacts on economics there will be significant for how coastal communities respond to this situation. And view sheds, of course, these turbines that are being considered now for offshore wind, and I'll rely on Jason to give maybe better information, but are 800 feet tall. They're massive. And so if you look out at the ocean and think about wide open horizon, and then you think of these massive turbines out there, the view shed is extremely impactful. Interesting, but could really be problematic for view sheds and disturbing just the natural beauty of and nature of the Oregon coast. There are a bunch of ecosystem impacts that need to be considered more, things like interactions with birds, which are a real problem with wind turbines on land, protected species like whales interacting with the turbines and getting ensnared maybe in gear around the wind turbine floating platforms. And then there are considerations about our ports and whether they're ready to have this kind of development offshore and support it, but also how we get that energy onshore and put it into our grid and whether it's ready to do that. So I didn't cover a lot of the things that I wanted to cover because I'm going first. And so I just wanted to kind of give a broad swath of, where we are, what is happening off of our shore, and hopefully other panelists will focus in on some of the specifics and then your questions and answers as well. So I'll end just with kind of a listing of some of the federal laws that are in question relative to authorization of offshore wind and that are going to be involved in the process of authorizing it. NEPA, for sure, the National Environmental Protection Act will certainly be part of it. The Coastal Zone Management Act, the state's authority and the territorial sea, I already mentioned. Under both of those, the Coastal Zone Management Act and the territorial sea, we have a legal tool called a geographic location descriptor that we can get into if there are questions about that. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and then there are all the cultural values around private space or public trust, which is a really different legal framework for the ocean, and thinking about business and property ownership in our waters in support of our coastal communities. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to hearing comments from other panelists.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we have Jason Searman from the Oregon Department of Energy.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up, hopefully. See, where should I start? So thanks for the introduction. I guess it's been a little bit after Karin walked us through a lot of great input and thoughts. So I'll reintroduce myself, Jason Searman, Oregon Department of Energy. Have some background in environmental engineering and business and law, and primarily work on clean energy, renewable energy issues with utility companies, policymakers here in the state. I think what I'd like to probably talk about is a little background on offshore wind. I think Karin made some references that I can help kind of set some context for, I suppose, and maybe that is my primary benefit here, is just setting some context on the technology, renewable clean energy goals for the state and the region. It's a hot topic. Climate change, a lot of movement towards 100% clean ambitions and targets at the federal level and the state level and across the globe, really. And so that can maybe help with some context. And I might just use this slide deck I was looking at from my kickoff meeting. I've been giving a couple meetings about offshore wind over the past few months, and so I do have some visuals that might help just to kind of, it's hard to visualize scale and numbers, I feel like, in general, and maybe some pictures and stuff would help that. So if that's okay, maybe I'll try to share my screen. Be a challenge here, but we'll see what we can do. Share screen. Maybe if I could get another thumbs up if people are seeing my screen, that'd be helpful. And hopefully it's the one with the
Looks good, Jason.
white background. Okay, and the green thing on the right, green circles.
Yes, we're able to see it.
All right, great. So again, I know I'm kind of short on time with this panel, and I had more time in my other meetings, so I'm going to just click through these slides and see what looks good to talk about for a few seconds, and then keep us moving along. But House Bill 2021 is probably where I'd start. That was legislation from last year's session here in Oregon that put us on a trajectory for 100% clean electricity across our state, and primarily applies to investor-owned utilities, which would be like Portland General Electric here in the Portland region, Pacificor and other territories of the state. I'm not too sure who. I think it's probably Eugene, Water and Electric, and some other consumer-owned utilities. So that's kind of the difference. There's publicly owned power, and there's a few utilities down around Eugene that would fit in that category, and then there's investor-owned utilities. Anyway, the main takeaway there is 100% clean for the state. And then it also had a bundle of other provisions in it that are kind of just the smaller circles around the green circle there. And that's probably the overview everybody needs, just to keep in mind. So people are thinking about this nexus of clean energy and labor standards, you know, that we want it to be high paying union jobs, high quality jobs, to the extent possible. The advantages of reducing fossil fuels, obviously, community green energy, community resilience, small scale, renewable energy study were all pieces of this to kind of look at the whole big picture, which I'll talk about in a couple other slides here. And there's a couple different big pictures. There's the big picture of who else is working on clean energy, and what the landscape of those commitments are. And then the other big picture is, you know, how much renewable energy are we talking about? So I'll talk a little bit about both those. So the big takeaway for this one is if you just look in the Northwest or the Western region there, you can hopefully see a little bit of the hard to read numbers, but I can just call them out. You know, California has 100% by 2045. Oregon has that 100% by 2040 after House Bill 2021. Washington is also 100% by 2045, I believe. Idaho Power is 100% by 2045. So, you know, as we know, you know, 2021 sounded like a long time away, and here we are in 2022, and 2040 sounds like a long time away, but it's going to be around the corner in here before you know it. So that's kind of the impetus of trying to understand what does all this mean? How much renewable energy does this mean? So here's a couple of graphs, this one and a few after, that kind of help maybe bring that into focus a little bit. This slide is from the region's Power Council, which has an office here up in Portland, but they're represented from states in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Montana. And they're a council that kind of looks at all the utilities in the region and assesses you know, what demand is looking like, and do we have enough resources built to meet our demand to keep the lights on. In the blue here, I think, is wind that's been built over the past 20 years. So the time scale on the bottom is like early 2000s to basically today. And the blue is wind, and that's 10,000. You'll hear a lot about megawatts and gigawatts in energy. So maybe this slide can help get us on talking the same language and a sense of the scale. 10,000 megawatts is 10 gigawatts. So we have about 10,000 megawatts of wind and a little bit of solar. You know, the orange at the top is the solar that's come on lately. So I'll move to the next slide, but keep that in mind. And that was what we had currently. So this is going out to 2041 on the bottom, the timeline there. And this is a forecast for what we would need with all those 100% clean energy commitments in mind for the Pacific Northwest. Would be another 5 gigawatts, so 5,000 megawatts by about 2027, and then 14 gigawatts by 2040. So pretty big numbers. The Pacific Northwest currently has about 60 gigawatts. So that's everything, like all the hydro, the nuclear plants out near the Tri-Cities, all the coal plants, gas plants, all the renewables. We have about 60 gigawatts in the Pacific Northwest built to date. And that was, you know, all the stuff that's been built over the past 100 years. So 14 gigawatts by 2040 is a pretty sizable chunk. It gets even bigger though when you start looking at the whole West. So if you start looking at California and those other states I had on that map that are primarily, you know, kind of west of Colorado, that's the Western grid. And so there's also forecasts for what it would take to meet all the clean energy commitments for the whole Western grid. And that's more like a 350 gigawatt number. And the whole grid is interconnected. So stuff that's built in Arizona, you know, that electricity can travel up here. We send a lot of hydro down to other parts of the West, specifically California, in like summers when it's really hot down there. So we're kind of like lean on each other and help each other at different times of the years, because we all have different times when it's really cold and different times when it's really hot. And so different times when we all need a lot of energy, and that's kind of spread around and pops up at different times. Sometimes it can hit us all at the same time, which is, the peakiest, worst case scenario. So anyway, the question is, can it all get in built time, and where is it all going to get built, right? I mean, those are pretty big numbers, even if you're not familiar with the megawatts and gigawatts as much as I am. I can tell you that's a lot. Like 1,000 megawatts, which again is about 1 gigawatt. That's like the size of a traditional nuclear plant, a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant. So we need like 350's worth of those, but in renewable energy. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Maybe some information on the height. It's not on this slide specifically, but the offshore wind is taller and bigger than the stuff on land. I think Karin referenced that. The winds also get stronger the further you get out into the ocean. You can imagine kind of how that works intuitively if you're a sailor, or can imagine sailboats operating before we had them powered with fossil fuels. Pretty powerful winds out there that take us all over the place, and they're pretty consistent. So you add those up, and that's why you get more wind energy further out at sea, and you can get out further with these floating platforms that what we have out here on the West Coast with our ocean profile and continental shelf. We would be doing potentially floating offshore wind, not these fixed bottoms. The fixed bottom stuff is taking place more on the East Coast, where they have shallower coastlines. And there's just a whole bunch of complicated factors that kind of make the onshore wind activities out east being a little further along than they are here on the West Coast. I mean, if it's helpful, I can kind of talk about them. Just let me know if I'm getting close to time, because I do want to cover the state study. Charles, if you're helping out with time. So on the East Coast, everybody has different resource mixes. It's windier in the Midwest on land than it is in other parts. It's sunnier, obviously, down in Texas and Arizona. The East Coast is, kind of a mixed bag. It's sunny in the summer and cold in the winter. They do have some hydropower. Niagara Falls in the New York area up there was some of the first big large-scale energy resources in the whole country back around Thomas Edison days. So they do have hydro, but they don't have as much of it compared to how many people live out there. Let me see if I can, yeah, that's what I was looking for. So this is a nice way to kind of imagine where all the hotspots are for electricity use. Like where do we use it all? And this is the image at night that just shows, where all the high load centers are. So the East Coast, is kind of lit up like a Christmas tree. So they have a lot of hydro and they have a lot of energy, but they also have a lot of people and a lot of industry, a lot of demand basically for electricity. And so they need more power. And so that's a factor. The shallower water makes it easier to build. I think I have another slide about that. And they also have state offshore wind targets, which we don't have yet on the West Coast. And so that's like specific procurement targets that are basically functioning like moving the economic case for offshore wind forward. So they're further along and they're doing offshore wind development. If you turn to the West Coast, we don't have a lot of those things. You can see the loads are far smaller compared to the broader eastern region there. We have tons of hydro, abundant hydro, relatively speaking. And so all that kind of helps keep our cost of power down and meets our needs, which influences kind of the trade-offs and the analysis of how offshore wind would benefit us. So yeah, the deeper waters, we don't have any offshore wind targets. So the key challenges are transmission and floating platforms. So we can't fix them in the bottom, and so they need to float, and these technologies are kind of moving along in early days still. So let me kind of move through this. Here again are some numbers. This actually is helpful, the point of me using these slides is to help visualize. So floating offshore wind, I mean, the amount that's been deployed in the whole world is 0.08 gigawatts, super small number compared to how much has been built on land, 707 gigawatts of land-based wind, 35 of that bottom fixed offshore wind I was pointing to that's kind of popping up on the East Coast. Floating offshore wind is kind of, you can just kind of see where we're at with that. So I think I covered this. The bottom fixed is just a little bit less complicated to install. It's further along. The technology is more, mature, and the floating market is lagging behind those numbers, the smaller numbers there, because it's newer technology, a little bit more complicated to install. So yeah, I don't know, people can probably visualize this in their head, but that, the turbines would float out in the ocean and connect into the grid here. And the grid, in addition to, all the fisheries, potential impacts and concerns, and everything else, habitat. I mean, I kind of have an energy background, so I'm going to stick on the energy topics here. And then maybe happy to answer energy questions after I'm done, and let others kind of talk about the fisheries impacts. But the land impacts are also something to think about on the benefits and the challenges. One of the big challenges is figuring out how much offshore wind would get built, and then can the transmission grid absorb all that power. So here's a map showing like really big transmission lines in the state, greater than 345 kilovolts. Takeaway from this slide would be, the big nuclear plant and the hydro dams along the lower Snake and the Columbia River. That's kind of why all this, I don't know if people can see my cursor. I mean, that's why all this transmission up here is so robust, right? We're trying to bring all these big energy projects, all the power to like the load centers and connect it down to California and where it needs to go. And the load centers out on the coast are relatively small. There's not a lot of industry and population out there, so they get away with basically having smaller lines feed them. Maybe this map helps show those. So these are like still pretty big transmission lines that cross over the coast range, but not as big as the boulder lines. And so anyway, the smaller the line, the more limited the capacity is to transfer electricity across them. So if a lot of offshore wind would ever get built, the transmission lines would potentially need to get upgraded to bring that power into the valley. I think we talked a little bit about who the permitting agency is out in federal ocean waters. It's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Department of Land Conservation Development couldn't be here today. I believe both BOEM and DLCD were invited. Saturday timing, and with everything on everybody's plates, it's kind of hard to get here. But yeah, I mean, maybe Karin and I can answer questions as best we can. But they're the experts. They're the lead folks on the federal water activity, and then when transmission would come to land further along in any project, if areas get leased, and if there's a bidder and a buyer and this all progresses, then transmission systems would probably be a permit that would have to get acquired to connect into the land grid. And then this is kind of why the interest. I mean, the winds are super strong. I think I showed it in one of my earlier slides, but that Southern Oregon, Northern California areas, anything over like 10 meters per second is like amazing wind considered on land. And so you start seeing things all over the ocean waters that are over 9 and into 10. I mean, that's getting people's attention, but the economics and the permitting and the challenge, all these benefits and challenges, like we're just in the early days of even figuring out how all this could fit together, and if it could pencil out economically. I mean, it's not going to get built if there's not a buyer. So early days, but yeah. And then this is kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, if that's okay, is, and I'll just run through it. The House Bill 3375 was another bill that was passed in 2021, and that set this 3 gigawatt planning goal. So that recognizes kind of the interest in offshore wind, some of the benefits and challenges were stated, but it also wants to know more. And so the legislature wants to know more. And so it asked the department to do this study on the benefits and challenges. And then that 3 gigawatt goal to plan number is less like these other goals on the East Coast, where it's a hard procurement target. It's more of a goal to plan for 3 gigawatts, just because I think it takes a long time for a lot of stuff to get developed, if we ever needed to build it or if there was a buyer for it, trying to stay ahead of that. Big components for the study are the literature review. I reviewed existing studies. You can get more information on the website. Just type in, Oregon Department of Energy floating offshore wind study, and it should pop up into Google or whatever search engine. We're convening a couple public meetings to gather stakeholder feedback. We already did one round of outreach and gathering, and all the presenters here are involved in this and have provided great feedback. So thank you, Karen, Susan, Mike, for all your engagement so far and into the future. The bottom takeaway for this study is a report to the legislature in September of this year. So that's what we're building up to, and all this data and information we're gathering. So we're gathering and synthesizing a range of information and perspectives on the effects of potential effects of offshore wind into the grid by 2030. These are some of the topics that were called out in the bill. Here's our timeline. We're right around here in the March already, but our first public meeting is next week. And, we'll try to get the draft report maybe posted on the website in July, submitted in September. And then I'll leave this up for a couple seconds, but I'm done. I think that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time, everybody. And these are the topics, that we'll be talking about and looking at into our study more. So is that helpful?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so the next person can.
Great. I think now we are ready to hear from either Susan or Mike on their perspective from the fishing industry.
Okay. Since you introduced us, I'll just go in the order that you introduced us. Good morning, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here. My name is Susan Chambers. I'm with the West Coast Seafood Processors Association. Our companies range from small mom and pop operations to the largest corporations on the West Coast, from Washington to California. Just want to do a quick thank you to Dr. Braby, who covered some of what I was going to talk about, so you won't have to hear it twice. And a shout out to Jason too, because the Oregon Department of Energy's draft report on floating offshore wind is very good. Unlike reading a stock assessment for fish, which sometimes can put me to sleep, the report from Oregon Department of Energy had a lot of really good information that I could understand. So it's a really good resource. So a little bit of background. I've been involved in the offshore energy debate since the mid-2000s, when wave energy developers wanted to put 200 wave energy buoys on prime crab fishing grounds. The one prototype wave energy buoy sank off of Newport. Politics, realities changed, and the world moved on to offshore wind energy. So the biggest threat is also the most obvious. The biggest threat to fishermen is also the most obvious. We're going to lose fishing grounds. There's no, you just can't argue with that. We cannot fish in the same places as these wind turbines go. You have anchor lines, you have anchors, we tow nets behind our boat. We have lines out in the water off to the side. There's no way you can do it. Even though the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management says well, we have no problem if you fish in there. However, the way they're built, the way fishing vessels operate, they're mutually exclusive for the most part. However, the discussion is not that simple. Nobody is, well, few people are really hitting pause on this giant rush to get floating offshore wind. We're not asking the questions. We're not answering the questions that need to be answered before we put these things in the water. Dr. Braby talked about, elimination of existing fishing and processing jobs, ocean user conflicts. There's also a food security issue. We are part of the agriculture part of this country, and it is our responsibility to produce sustainable, nutritious food to the public. So there is a food security risk there. Offshore wind could also jeopardize our long-term fisheries surveys and our fisheries management work. There are potential port use conflicts that could make coastal communities less resilient. And there's other considerations. Overall, like Dr. Braby also said, this is a top-down process. This is not a bottom-up process. Fishermen come from a management scenario where we are at the table, we are respected, we are listened to, and that's not happening with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. For example, and I'll probably be a lot less kind about BOEM. Dr. Braby was very diplomatic, but it is extremely frustrating when, for example, at a meeting yesterday, several fishermen, processors, even environmental groups and tribes have asked for a programmatic environmental impact statement for the wind energy areas off of California, the proposed areas off of Oregon, so we can look at the cumulative impacts across the California current. And BOEM just plain said, you're not going to like the answer. That's not the way we do business. So we're not going to do a programmatic EIS, despite several, dozens of comments. And the same happened on the East Coast. So it's frustrating for the seafood industry to figure out how to work with an agency that is opaque and inflexible. How do we work with developers on mitigation plans or avoidance? Another example is Morro Bay in California, where I think, could be wrong, but it was like 14 developers had an interest in that area. So BOEM says, we're not going to do any compensation plans. So is it up to the seafood industry to work with every single developer to work on mitigation plans, work on avoidance plans, ask for some kind of compensation? It's really tough for us to figure out how to navigate that and have meaningful engagement, not just engagement where BOEM will take input, but how do we convince them that, if you move this area, it would stay out of our fishing grounds. It's really an inflexible process. So under the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, we have 8 regional councils around the country. 8? Yes. They're called Regional Fishery Management Councils, and they each have advisory bodies, and it has fishermen, tribes, conservation groups, sport and commercial fishermen at the table. And there's even sport and commercial fishermen on the council itself. So we have a standard set of metrics and thresholds and that we are familiar with. Say, for example, I want to try a new type of fishing gear. I go to the advisory body and the council and the state and say, hey, I want to try this fishing gear. And they say, okay, well, let's set up an exempted fishing permit. You give us a permit, we try it out. But before we even get the permit, we have to prove it's not going to entangle whales or sea turtles, or, the chances are, the risks are low. We have to make sure we're not going to damage some of that rocky habitat, like Dr. Braby talked about, because that is where our rockfish live. We have to answer a whole suite of questions and provide data showing how we will minimize our effects on the environment before we even get a permit. On the flip side, BOEM says, we're going to issue these call areas. We'll narrow them down to wind energy areas. Then we will sell leases. And then we'll do an environmental impact study after the companies submit the construction and operations plan. So we really don't get any in-depth environmental analysis or environmental impacts studies done until the final part of the leasing process, which to fishermen and processors, it just seems backwards, because we have to do it the completely other way around in the council management process. So, that is really frustrating. This process also seems to generate more questions than answers. What are some of the proposed socioeconomic effects on the coastal communities? We don't even know what the metrics are for the decision-making process. We don't know who makes the decisions. Does it go all the way up to Secretary Holland at the Department of Interior, or does it stay on the Pacific coast? We don't know who decides what fishery data is in or out. For example, when, excuse me, when BOEM announced the call areas in Oregon, they were placed on some of our prime Pacific whiting and sablefish fishing grounds. Those are two of the biggest value fisheries to Oregon. So why did BOEM put them there? All the areas are on the south coast of Oregon. All the areas are in great wind potential. Anybody who's visited Cape Blanco or south, especially on the water, the wind blows there. But it's also in rockfish habitat. And these rockfish live, 75, 100, 120 years. So if you ruin that habitat, you're going to lose a lot of year classes of those fish. Really good fish. Make excellent fish tacos, by the way. Some of the other questions: why does BOEM insist on only project level environmental assessments and not the bigger programmatic environmental assessments or EISs? We haven't just determined what the transmission routes are to shore, or what areas would be good transmission routes to shore. We don't know if whales will be more at risk to vessel strikes from, ships servicing these offshore wind platforms, or if whales may be subject to more vessel strikes because the offshore wind platforms are over here, fishing vessels are crowded over here. If this is the whales corridor migration route, what are the greater chances that there will be more ship strikes or vessel strikes? How will the wind farms affect upwelling? Upwelling is when the wind blows and creates brings nutrients up from the ocean floor. And we need that. So if you're on the coast in the spring and it's blowing cold out of the northwest and it's blowing that way on the ocean, that is our upwelling. We need that to keep our fish healthy, our California current system working. So we have forage fish for birds. So we have the larval, stages of some fish and shellfish for whales, etc. We don't know if there's going to be a wind wake behind these turbines that will affect that upwelling. One other question is safety. Dozens of these turbines in one small area could cause problems for vessels' radar. So how are we going to go about fixing that? Is there a way to mitigate that? I just don't, I don't have the answers, but nobody else is answering those questions either. And I guess that's pretty much it, since, like I said, Karen did a great job of covering some of the background of BOEM and how we got here. The only other thing I'd like to mention is when the wave energy was transitioning over to wind energy back in the 2006, 2007, the Federal Power Act, or the Energy Policy Act of 2005, came into question. And you guys probably know more about this than I do. I just remember at the time with wave energy, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was the guiding government agency. But they were in a sort of tug of war with BOEM over who would govern offshore wind and offshore wave. Later on, it became clear that BOEM was going to be the one. So I don't know if there's a way to get the Federal Power Act back into this, but that's just another question. So I will stop there and give Mike Oak Connecky some time for his presentation. And thank you. If you have any questions, put them in and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.
Go ahead, Charles, or?
Yeah, you're all set. Thank you.
Okay, I've got some comments on another document, so just give me a second here if you would, please. First off, what Charles, my name's Mike Oak Connecky. I've been working with Pacific Seafood for the last 27 years. And before that, I started the industry in 1970, so you can kind of figure it out. After I got out of college, was bumming around looking for work so I could go back and get a master's degree. It never happened. Spent about 20 years of my time up in Alaska or managing operations in Alaska. So, but right now I'm semi-retired, I think, and working part-time as a consultant for Pacific Seafood, and also representing a group called West Coast Pelagic Conservation Group. Won't get into that one. Thank you for good presentations, and Karen for getting us on here, but I'll get through this as quickly as I can. For the fishing industry, and we're looking at, I think, as I read it, what does this mean for those who rely on the coast and ocean for revenue? In the fisheries, what I see going on right now is the potential to wipe out the entire major commercial fishing in the United States, not just except for Alaska. And they've got plans up there too, but they're a little bit different. So here's my take on this thing. You can't avoid conflict in areas that offshore wind is going to occupy. It will categorically preclude most, if not all, fishing areas in those areas. And if you say, well, okay, why can't they share 30% or 40% of those areas? There's already a huge amount of area in the ocean that's set off limits for fishing. And you get up to this principle, the straw that broke the camel's back. You need X amount of income or you can't cover your costs, whether it's a fishing boat or a processing plant. When you start shutting down individual areas, one by one, those costs mount up the income drops. The costs may not mount up, but the income drops. You can't keep crews working on a year-round basis. And you erode away the backbone of what makes these fisheries work. And that is that overall, the strongest point is you've got multiple fisheries that can keep boats and plants operating enough time of the year that they can make enough income to be a good business proposition. It's still difficult, don't get me wrong. It's the most dangerous occupation you can have is fishing. And I have a lot of respect for those people. A lot of my friends are fishermen. even though I'm a processor at heart. One thing that BOEM we've found out that at 1,300 meters, most of the boats, of vessels, if not all, different regulatory sectors of fishing, albacore, salmon, bottom fish, at 1,300 meters, we could avoid most, if not all, of this conflict. But I've listened to the developers calls, and they're afraid that if they do that or go out farther, they're going to have more cost. Well, the costs are not probably going to be totally insignificant, but they're probably only a few percent higher than what their other capital costs are. And the government is subsidizing this to a healthy tune, I think between 30–50%. So if we don't do something to get some of these wind farms farther offshore, we are going to lose fisheries. When the Oregon Task Force met, was one fisherman, I think he's been in the business 40 years. He's second generation, I believe, and he's got his family owning some of his boats. He's got 3 boats. 95% is what he declared of the fish come out of the call areas where they decided to put them down in Southern Oregon. He said he's done, essentially, or done, period, unless he can find another place to go. And that's not likely. So I'm going to touch on this NEPA process. I think Susan covered it pretty well, but there's two other sides of this, and you got to look at. And one is, if you allow the lease to go out before there's a full NEPA process, and like programmatic EIS, then you've already got a conditional contract in effect that the intent is to get to the end point of development. And once the lease is out, and that costs quite a bit of money itself, getting the lease and paying the payment for it. But then you've got the developers have survey responsibilities they have to take care of, and which is largely designed by their own people, which seems backwards. It seems like the government should intervene or oversee that at least. And the other part of it is, well, you could have maybe up to $1 billion, of different expenses out there if you've got, say, 10 different wind farms going on inside of an area. And so they've got all this money on the line and they have a lease in their hands, and all of a sudden they're going to jerk the rug out from under them because of something. I think the chances of that happening are very slim, regardless of what the EIS process tells you. Or they're going to, I'll just say it, cheat on the EIS process. It's done by BOEM, which I think they need an independent agency to do that process. NIMS is very good at it, but NIMS is subjugated to the needs of BOEM. They do not really have a voice in the action that goes on, action decisions. Most of these the second part of this is the cumulative impacts. By cumulative impacts, I mean something a little bit more, and that is, are we going to have 10 wind farms out off our coast, or are we going to have 100 off our coast? There's a big difference in what those impacts will be. There's no plan, or if there is a plan, somebody's keeping it secretive, because we've never heard on the East Coast or the West Coast how many of these wind farms are going to put in effect or into operation. Foreign multinationals. Most of these projects are going to be managed by foreign multinational corporations that have LLCs in the United States. They will qualify as a US corporation, the faces that you see, but they're still owned and backed by foreign multinational money and expertise. I think that people think that all that money is going to stay in the United States. I think that would be a mistake to believe that. Power to California. Are we going to sacrifice our fisheries to set up a power grid that feeds into California? I think what I heard from Jason suggests that that's exactly the case in Southern Oregon anyway. And also Jason said one thing, that they won't build the infrastructure to handle the power if there is no buyer. Well, they're building the wind farms, so somehow that power's got to go someplace. There's probably be over $1 trillion by the time they're done invested in this stuff, or maybe that's a little, well, if you count the land base, it probably will exceed that. So but if there's no buyers and you're putting up the turbines, how does that work? I guess they would be forced to buy when you start shutting down fossil fuel plants and other things, but we don't even know what the cost of the consumer will be. We have some ideas from, well, I've heard big differences of opinion on that one. The BOEM process is a different subject. The BOEM offshore wind energy process in general is horribly flawed for a variety of reasons. There is no roadmap of how they're going to do this, or we don't know how many they're going to do. There are no state, and another part is BOEM has no accountability for any of their actions. Are they going to be around to govern these developers after they're put up their wind farms? There's no answer to that yet. I don't know who does that, safety standards and all that. We can't find that information out. There's no stated metrics for decision-making. This has been brought up, but it's a huge issue. They're not operating like by regulation, they're operating by guidelines. It's a very subjective process, and we don't even know who makes final decisions on stuff. The West Coast director said he would make decision on leasing. I've heard that it goes up to the director in Washington, DC for BOEM. I don't know which is right. Would a project be rejected? So far, there's 16 of them going into effect on the East Coast. 2 more are in a holding pattern for development. But if there's bird kills, too many bird kills, too many whale interactions, or fishing gets wiped off the map by a wind project, are they going to move it at the point where they've already got who knows how much money invested, certainly in the millions? It's, again, not likely. And so far, they have not changed any projects except for very minor alterations. And I think I've probably used up my time, so I will stop there, but I've got a lot more. And if anybody wants to see a list of it, I'd be glad to send it out. Thank you.
Great, thank you guys. So we have about 7 minutes to answer any questions. I know that there's one question in the chat regarding, the question is why, I think the question is mostly why offshore wind development is happening if it seems relatively expensive. That might be a question more posed for Jason.
Yeah, I saw that question. Yeah, maybe I'll do my best. You know, and the big picture lens and kind of seeing how all this we're really at a pivotal moment in time, right? And offshore wind is kind of like this, you could pick probably any of a handful of topics and get to like the nexus that I'm about to kind of put out there is like, the IPCC came out with this recent report a couple days ago. It was in the news, you know, how we need to do as much as possible for climate change, as fast as possible, it's seemingly said, right? So there's urgency to change energy systems, plant more trees, both sides, you know, the sinks and the sources of carbon. There's the costs that have to do with all that. And then there's all balancing all these potential effects to, you know, our food supply system, agriculture, the ocean equivalent of that with the fisheries and ecosystems. And so there's like, you know, those 3 things are like, it's like the space race or like the biggest challenge of the day, right? And so nobody has all the answers, and it's a global problem, and everybody's, you know, COP, whatever number it was, and the global people who meet, you know, every year, every couple of years, you know, Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen, all these things, like everybody's trying to figure it out. There really isn't a cohesive, comprehensive plan. And so offshore wind is kind of just like a microcosm of these bigger issues. Like everybody's trying to trade off all these balances and figure out a solution for the benefit of everybody. So that's kind of the big picture. With offshore wind, you know, I was kind of mentioning, and maybe it didn't come across as clearly as I would have liked it to, but the fixed bottom stuff is moving along at a faster clip because it's easier. It's more like the stuff on land, the technology exists. But even that is in early days on the East Coast, and they've got all these transmission issues to figure out, and siting issues and ecosystem, cumulative effects analysis, like all the same issues we have here. The difference is like these floating platforms that would be used out here are also in early days. And so you've kind of got some stuff that needs to get figured out on that technology front. I think scalability, how to produce it, like, you know, with economies of scale, like roll them off, like serial production and stuff. So there's a lot of things that need to get figured out. Probably the best kind of thing I can use as an example is in 2015, there was also interest in offshore wind and there wasn't a buyer. So that's what I meant. Like, it's not just the transmission wouldn't get built, like the offshore wind itself wouldn't get built if there isn't a buyer. And so the process is kind of flipped. And people have mentioned that, and I don't know how else to describe it other than use that characterization. But with land-based projects, you know, there isn't like this federal agency you necessarily have to go through all the time to get even just the contours of a project so that you can then shop it around to see if there's any buyers. So that's why maybe there's other reasons too. I wish Bohm was here, but you know, that's how I kind of see the kind of flipping of this and why it's kind of creating so much confusion and consternation and legitimate concerns about cumulative impacts and stuff like that. Is these leases will go out, but that doesn't mean that there's a buyer yet. And so it's like this progression of iterative steps that need to unfold. And so what's different from today than 2015 was all that 100% clean stuff I was trying to highlight for everybody. 2015, we were kind of in a different world, not only pre-COVID, but you know, these 100% clean ambitions just weren't as widespread. Now, kind of everybody is maybe not marching completely north, but there's less like divergence and there's more kind of alignment on we need to do some stuff on 100% clean and renewables and both sides of the sources and sinks. And so it's just a complicated mess that we're all trying to figure out. And it's great time to be alive and be part of these discussions because there's so many important things we need to look at. But just wrapping it all up here for this question is, we're in 2022. California is also going through call areas, same process. They're a little bit ahead of us. You know, if these people, the developers, you know, whoever is leasing these areas, get some leases, the next step is to see who's going to buy the power. And we don't know, I guess, especially in Oregon, our utilities haven't analyzed it. There's nobody pointing to it yet. That could change in 2023. We'll get new analysis. We get new analysis every year, every 2 years, as all these technologies kind of unfold. And solar is, you know, compared to offshore wind and, you know, all these things. The big takeaway from the grid's perspective is diversity is key, right? The sun doesn't always shine. Wind blows at different times. And so they're trying to stack those and make sure that we have energy at all times of the day when we need it. And that's kind of the value of offshore wind, and whether that plays out, you know, pencils out into something that somebody would want to buy because it makes sense more than like building a ton of batteries to store it. The solar, you know, it's for when you need it. That's kind of, those are the trade-offs. So maybe that helps a little bit. And I don't think it's settled that these are cost effective. I think that's still an open question.
Great. I know Karin had her hand raised. We'll probably get cut off here. So if the panel does disappear, I do apologize for that.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think why in the ocean, there is a different question or a different answer to that, which is chronic. The ocean has suffered for decades and decades, if not centuries, from being a public trust resource, and one that isn't appreciated in terms of our reliance on it for our own health, for our food systems, for cultural importance. And right now, as Jason has pointed out, we're at this juncture where we are considering privatization of the ocean. It is a huge shift from where we have been forever. And so I think that there is a perception that the ocean is open. It is available. It's out there. There's nothing there. It's just water. While we can talk about fisheries, we can talk about the importance of habitat, there is a sense, there is a cultural norm that the ocean is vast and a frontier and is endless. And you've heard today that it is not endless. There is a huge amount of structure, a huge amount of sensitivity to the way that the ocean functions and supports us as humans that is at risk from industrialization and development of the ocean. And so those are the really thorny problems that we're trying to find some kind of solution to and be really careful about as we take steps forward considering offshore wind. So thanks for having us.
Great, yes. I wish we had time to answer all the questions, but unfortunately there is a panel that is scheduled to be on this exact link right after this. I wanted to thank all of the panelists again, as well as the University of Oregon's ENR Law Center for all of their support. And if you guys have any questions for the panelists, feel free to email them. Feel free to email the questions to me and I can distribute them. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be here.